Director of Studies of Salt Idiomes, and welcome back to our 5-minute tips to help pass the first. Okay, the last video we looked at the Reading and Use of English Part 1, now we're moving on to Part 2. Okay, Part 1, as you remember, was the multiple choice, okay? We had 8 spaces and you had 4 possible words to go in each space. Part 2, well, you don't have the words, so we just have the text and the spaces. Now, as in Part 1, think of the time, okay? Very, very important. Part 1 was 7 to 8 minutes, and I would suggest doing pretty much the same with this part, okay? 7 to 8 minutes, that will give you more time to dedicate to the more difficult parts of the reading which come later in the exam. So, going back to Part 2. Now, just as you did in Part 1, read the text thoroughly, okay? Don't read to the space and try to guess the word. It's very, very difficult like this. So, read the text thoroughly. Get an idea of exactly what it's trying to say. As you're reading, you'll probably get an idea of some of the words or some of the types of words that you need to put into the spaces just from reading. Now, Part 1, we were dealing with some quite specific difficult vocabulary. Okay, you don't have that in Part 2. Part 2 is very much grammar analysis. What you're going to have is auxiliary verbs, prepositions, connectors, okay? This is the kind of things, pronouns, relative pronouns. So, bear in mind that you're not going to be looking for complicated vocabulary, right? So, very important, once you've read it and you've got a very good understanding of the text, then analyze the sentences, okay? It's very important to look at the words that come before and after to really get the correct word, okay? So, have a read of all of this, and let's take the first one, for example, number 9. Okay, so on the Atlantic coast of France, about 60 kilometers from the city of Bordeaux, there is a giant sand dune known as, very, very typical collocation, known as La Dune de Pilat, around 110 meters high, 3 kilometers, and 500 meters wide. It is famous that it receives about 1 million visitors a year. Okay, so you've read this. Now, what we have is an adjective and that, okay? Now, in the phrase there are key words that give you a very good idea of what the word could be. So, you have to think, what word can come before an adjective that really accentuates the adjective? And that is the key word, okay? So, sometimes you think, okay, famous adjective, you want to accentuate, maybe you can put to, okay? But because we have that, it has to be so. It is so famous that. So, what you have to do, read it thoroughly, identify the key words, okay, analyze the phrase, and then try to come up with the best word. Also, take into consideration where the word is in the phrase. If it's the beginning of the phrase, could be a connector. Have a look at the punctuation, okay? If there's commas, think of which words go with commas. Could be however. These are the typical words that come in this section of the exam. Okay, so again, 7 to 8 minutes, read it thoroughly, try to have a look, analyse what's around, and read the complete phrase. Okay, that should be enough. Thanks very much, we'll see you in Part 3.